All right. Good morning, everybody. We're a small, intrepid band today here in the Zendo because of our sticky overnight snowfall. So there are several interesting things intersecting here today. So let's see what interesting stuff, right, is sitting in that intersection. So this year, of course, we're investigating nyoho, doing things or making things according to the dharma of thusness. And again, in this first 4-month period, we are particularly focusing on one of the three faces of nyoho, which is clothing. So traditionally, of course, that means robes like rakusu and okesa, but there's also, of course, a much larger practice related to whatever we're wearing, how we acquire that, how we manage it, approach it, think about it, relate to it. So at the same time today, of course, we also have Buddhist Nirvana Day. So, death of Shakyamuni Buddha's physical body. This is the on or about the day in the year when we observe that. Nirvana Day, of course, is one of the three Sanbuki. That's redundant. Is one of the Sanbuki, the three Buddha days, right? So we have Buddha's birthday in April, we have his awakening in December, and we have Nirvana Day in February. So these three Sanbuki are important days of the year. So although this is quiet February, and usually in quiet February, we don't do Dharma talks. We simply focus on Zazen on Sundays, Zazen and Kinhin. These Sanbuki are really important observances for us. So it feels like every February we can't really skip over the death of Buddha's physical body, right? It feels like we need to observe that or at least be aware of that and mindful of that. So today we do have talk and service. So we're going to step outside of quiet February for just a little bit. So I'm also happy to say that we are rolling out today, or this week, a new e-booklet called Plum Blossoms in the Snow. And this is a compilation of Todo-san's teachings on the Sanbuki, on these three Buddha days, right? Plus a few of mine. So this original cover is by Hoshin. So we have original artwork from Hoshin. You can see that actually framed up in the common room, so that's there. So it's a kind of a joint effort, Todo-san and a little bit from me, and a cover from Hoshin. So this is about a 110-page booklet. It's available now as an e-booklet from Dogen Institute. So you can go out there and find this thing. So again, Plum Blossoms in the Snow. This is what it's going to look like out there. So although those teachings in this booklet were given for these specific Sanbuki, specific observances, the usefulness of that dharma is not limited to 3 days in the year, because really all of those teachings come back to the same question, which is how do we understand the Buddha treasure? How do we practice with the Buddha treasure? So we can really read these teachings at any point. It's not that we need to wait for a special occasion. Okay, so today we've got nyoho, things according to thusness. We've got a focus on the robe because that's our first 4-month segment. And we've got the death of Shakyamuni, right? So I'm going to toss all that stuff in a pot and stir it around and see what comes out, right? Strange bedfellows, perhaps. So in 2022, you may remember, we celebrated the 100th anniversary of Soto Zen in North America. So I was heavily involved with that. Shoryu, Hoshin was involved with that too. A bunch of us were. So at that time, Tenshin Anderson from San Francisco Zen Center Complex wrote a piece for Dharma Eye, which is Soto Shu's journal. You can go out actually online and read this semi-annual journal from Soto Shu. So Tenshin is now something like 82, right? He's been practicing for a while. I can't believe he's actually been around that long. So he's been practicing and teaching for some time. And in this piece that he wrote, he describes his 50-year-old black okesa. So when you ordain as a novice, your okesa is black. So this is his very first black okesa. It was made of linen. It was ordered for him. He did not make it himself. So this is not the case where he was doing the stitching by himself. But this was his okesa. So after his transmission, you may know after transmission we change colors. We actually file a form with Soto Shu that says we now have permission to wear something other than black. He decided he was going to bleach this black robe and change the color. So you may know when you bleach black fabric, it turns a lovely kind of rusty brown. So, of course, His idea was he's going to turn this black robe into something which is brown, which was a great idea. Indeed, he got a really lovely kind of a mottled brown color, which was not inappropriate. The problem was, of course, that that bleach was really hard on those linen fibers, right? After this robe had been around for a little while. He bleaches this robe and he notices it starts to disintegrate. So imagine, here's his sort of beloved linen black robe. He bleaches it and it actually starts to fall apart. So he writes about his experience of watching this robe disintegrating or falling apart. So now, if you've ever made nyoho, you probably felt by the end of that practice that you had really put a lot of time and attention and care and blood and sweat into making that thing, and that robe really became a precious thing for you. And that's on top of knowing it's not really your robe, it's Buddha's robe, right? So there's a lot of attachment around these things. You know, you're making this robe and you're wearing this robe, but you're wearing it as Buddha. You're not separate from Buddha. This is not your personal art project or your personal piece of clothing. You are wearing this because you're Buddha, right? Because it's Buddha's robe. So that robe takes on a certain importance. We don't sort of finish it and chuck it in a drawer and go, well, okay, check. Finished that, you know, on to the next thing. There are ways that we carry it and store it and put it on, and we wear these things for the rest of our lives. And right, they take on a certain importance for us. So imagine watching your robe falling apart in front of your eyes and thinking, perhaps, I did this thing. I decided to bleach this thing, and now, oh, here's Buddha's robe, and it's falling to fibers right in front of my eyes. You know, this is something that's important to me, and I caused this disintegration. And not only that, it's Buddha's robe. So, like, yikes, you know, who does that make me? I've kind of destroyed this robe. Now, he doesn't go into that, but I'm sort of reading that in there, thinking, putting myself in his position and thinking, right? So it may be that we are more likely to become attached to these robes precisely because we make them ourselves as nyoho-e, right? I have to admit that my commercially made okesa, my commercially made rakusus are, well, they mean something different to me, right? They don't mean quite the same thing to me as the things that I've sewed or that have been sewed for me. But no matter where they come from, of course, robes are not different from dharma, so we need to be careful about that pitfall, right? So if that's true, that robes are not different from dharma, then robes are impermanent. Well, that means dharma is also impermanent. And we just think, wait, how can that be? How can we be saying that the dharma is impermanent? Well, yes, the three treasures, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, are impermanent, like all conditioned things. So now we get to talk about this distinction that Todo-san always makes between impermanent and eternal, and what the relationship is between permanent, impermanent, and eternal. So we can find a good illustration of that in Shobogenzo Hotsubo or Arousing Bodhi Mind, where Dogen writes, our lives arise and perish within each ksana. So ksana is like that much time. Their swiftness is like this. Moment after moment, practitioners should not forget this principle. While being within this swiftness of the arising and perishing of transmigration in each ksana, if we arouse one single thought of ferrying others before ourselves, the eternal longevity of the Tathagata immediately manifests itself. So to me, I think the important things here, while being within the swiftness of the arising and perishing of transmigration, within this coming and going of birth and death and things moving all the time, within impermanence, if we arouse one single thought of ferrying others before ourselves, what is that? That's being a bodhisattva, right? That's helping people cross over to the other shore, helping people move toward liberation. So within this coming and going life and death, we decide to be bodhisattvas. We arouse even a single moment of this aspiration to help liberate other beings. The eternal longevity of the Tathagata immediately manifests itself. In other words, Buddha is there. Buddha is right there. So we are impermanent beings. We're changing all the time. And yet, as soon as we start practicing and behaving like bodhisattvas, then eternal Buddha is right there. So there is no time and place where that is not happening. It is not possible to be separate from that reality, right? There's something eternal within this impermanence of the functioning of the universe. And of course, there are other famous images of this teaching. Water droplets or waves on the ocean, all reflecting the moon. That's a poetic image. We certainly find that in text. We find it in Baika songs, right? So these waves or water droplets are individual. They're moving, they're changing, they're forming, they're evaporating, and they all reflect the same moon, right? So we know the moon often is an image of awakening or Buddha nature or something like that. So items made by nyoho can point us toward that kind of truth. Robes were traditionally made of scraps of fabric that were soiled or damaged or chewed by mice or used to wrap corpses or something, right? It's not fabric anybody would want. So today, of course, we typically make a trip to the fabric store, but traditionally this was fabric nobody would want. So this whole thing about reusing shroud fabric is really interesting to me, right? When we think about that as a traditional practice in the way we make these things. Somebody dies, that physical body becomes ash, because typically, it's cremation, and somehow we pick up the fabric and we sew a robe that is the same, not like, but the same as the stainless universal dharma. So we have this impression of this thing was on a corpse, this is somehow impure, not pure, not pleasant. And so we have a physical body, the physical body dies, fabric is wrapping this physical body. We take that fabric, as soon as we make Buddha's robe out of it, it is the same as the stainless universal dharma. That is a really interesting teaching. So there's some kind of through line there, I think, right, that deserves some pondering. So Ichukuma says that the robe, and I would say by extension anything made by nyoho, has profitless virtue. Now I've talked about that a bit before, but that's a really interesting phrase, profitless virtue. So of course this is the same teaching as zazen is good for nothing. Here we are again. Profitless virtue, zazen is good for nothing. So we don't make and wear these robes because they satisfy some individual need for showing off or being somebody or creating identity or displaying our needlework skills or this is a good color for me or whatever, right? This is not about my personal individual need. And as soon as that robe is not constrained by our personal individual desires, it is liberated as a boundless expression of Buddha or awakening. So isn't this interesting? We can liberate the robe. This robe, we put it on, we think it's liberating me. There's something reciprocal there. We can actually liberate that robe. And by extension, as I say, I think anything made by nyoho. And really, if we get down to it, anything we encounter, right? As soon as we drop our expectations about what I need from this thing, that thing is free to be what it is, which is a complete manifestation of the Dharma. So as soon as fabric from corpses is not constrained by our ideas about this association with death or impurity or unpleasantness or something, decay, it becomes Buddha's pure, limitless robe. So we've liberated that fabric in a really interesting way. So as soon as Buddha is not constrained by our desires for some kind of perfect teacher that's never going to leave us, is never going to make a mistake, is not going to be subject to human foibles or something, right? Buddha will never get sick and old and die and leave us, right? Then Buddha is free to live forever. We don't have to, sort of clutch Buddha, Dharma, Sangha to our chests and try to cling to them and protect them and keep them forever and ever, right? In an attempt to keep them around. So the three treasures and our robes and our sutra books and these bodies that we use as the ground of practice are all subject to coming and going, right? Something can happen to your sutra book, something can happen to your robe, something can happen to your Buddha statue, right? All these manifestations of three treasures are impermanent, and also they have this profitless virtue that makes them boundless, right? As soon as we see the profitless virtue, those things are boundless. So you can go online, maybe you've tried, go online and buy okesa and raksu, and some of these things are, you can buy them new, but I'm talking now about used ones. You can go online and buy them used, which I think is a really interesting situation, right? So some of these things are modern, they're lightly used, or maybe never used. Some of them are Edo period brocade, costing anywhere from a couple of $100 to $5,000. And these are commercially made items, they're not nyoho. But I see these things and I always wonder, how did someone's okesa or raksu end up on eBay? Right? Like, what's the story there? And I know there's a really good, interesting story. I'm not being judgy about that, but it's like, how did that happen, man? So then I imagine that some place somewhere in Japan, a clergy member got old and died, and there was no one left to run it's usually his tiny temple. And I just think, ouch, then what do you do with the robe? What if this was a person who was there by him or herself? And we know, I mean, one of the trends we're seeing in Japan is the number of clergy is dropping like this because they're getting old and they're dying off, and there aren't that many coming up after them. We already know we have thousands and thousands of what we call blue sky temples that have no clergy anymore, partly because sometimes the Danka have moved away, they've moved to town. I mean, they're changing demographics, right? But I'm just thinking it will happen more and more that clergy will die, and here are these temples, and what are they leaving behind them? All their artifacts, all their relics, and what happens to those things? Death in the robe, right? What happens to those things? Some of them end up on eBay, right? Interestingly, when you go to the Sotoshu conference, sometimes there's a table of things that you can buy. And one time when I went, there was a stack of old, very tattered okesa, and there was a sign on it that said, "Somebody please take these and do something with them." And I took them all home. Someday I'm going to remake them. But it makes you wonder, right? Like, how did that happen? What's going on there? So when Tonin and I were in Japan working on Todo-san's book on ryokan, we stopped at a temple. It wasn't a tiny temple. And I don't remember, frankly, now it's been some years, why we were there, what we were there to do, who we were there to see. I don't remember where or why. I was walking around in this temple complex, and I went into a room where there was a setup which was clearly about a memorial for somebody who had fairly recently died. This was not an active funeral, but there was something there that said to me, there's a memorial there. Some of the belongings were still set out, robes, artifacts, and I noticed a bica set. And turns out, of course, it was the clergy, or one of them in that temple, who had passed. So the wife came by while I was there looking at these things, and I asked whether was that what had happened, and was that this person's bica set? Well, yes, it was. She was kind of surprised that I knew what it was. Most Westerners maybe wouldn't know what a bica set. So bica, for those who are not familiar with bica, we have a hymn singing tradition in Soto Shu, in Soto Zen, with 2 handbells and singing, right? And so you have your set of bells. You treat them like you treat oryoki, or like you treat your robe, right? So I recognized what that was. She was surprised that I knew what that was, so I started singing. And she joined in with me, right? And we were having a lovely time kind of just singing together. And I thought, music is such a great connector, right? My Japanese wasn't really good enough to have a deep conversation with her. But it felt like there was this measure of common ground, even though we had just met, and we could share something with and about this person who had died, right? So again, where are those artifacts going, and what is going on after that person's passing? So anyway, I thought, I hope there's someone to carry on here. It was a big temple, so I've got to think there was somebody else to carry on. But, somebody else to take up those robes, and take up that bica set, and take up the dharma, and keep that temple going. So we have an important tradition in Zen of handing down robes from one generation to the next, whether that is new robes or existing robes, right? Even though you make it yourself, your teacher hands it to you. Your teacher gives you that robe as a manifestation of handing down precepts, handing down dharma, some kind of transmission, right? So you can't just sort of go online and download some of these instructions and figure out how to make a rakusu and then start wearing it. It doesn't work like that. Your teacher has to give you that, because there's something being handed off, being handed down, precepts, dharma, teaching something, right? So, of course, we can go all the way back to the famous story of the 6th ancestor, Huineng. So the 5th ancestor, Hongren, decided to hold a poetry contest to see who in his temple could best express the Dharma. I'm giving you the Reader's Digest version of this, of course, right? He says he's going to hand down his robe and his teachings to that person as his successor, whoever demonstrates Dharma mastery in the best way. So, of course, ultimately, Huineng wins this contest. Hongren explains to him that the Dharma was transmitted from mind to mind, whereas the robe is passed down physically from one generation to the next. So these things are in parallel. The Dharma is going from mind to mind. The robe is going from physical human being to physical human being. So then he tells Huineng, you need to get out of here before someone comes after you. So this is why, even to this day, we do Dharma transmission supposedly at midnight. We don't do it here that way. But right, there's a lot of sort of secrecy about Dharma transmission. So indeed, within a couple of months, guys are coming after Huineng, hundreds of men, supposedly, in the tradition, following him, trying to steal this robe and bowl, trying to oust him as the successor, maybe take that position for themselves or for somebody that they like better. I don't know. So they do catch up with him. He's gone into the mountains. He's gone out into nature, right? He's running from these people. When they catch up with him, though, he's got this robe on a rock, and they discover they can't lift it. They can't pick it up, and they can't carry it away. And they think, oh, there's something else going on here, right? So one way we can look at that story is that a robe with profitless virtue can't be stolen. We can't actually take it. That action is based on greed and clinging and attachment, and that kind of delusion has nothing to do with Buddha's robe, right? So profitless virtue, you can't steal somebody's robe. Interesting. It's a great illustration, I think, of this dharma and robe are one. So if you're wearing a robe inherited from your teacher, maybe your teacher even wore it, or given by your teacher if you created it and your teacher is giving it to you, you're occupying the same space as your teacher. There was a piece of Dharma transmission where we kind of enact that in an interesting kind of way. So all the ancestors, all the practitioners that come before you and come after you, including Shakyamuni, were all in that same space. So, of course, I'm talking about physical robe. These teachings apply to everybody, whether or not you're physically putting one of these things on. As soon as you start to practice, you find a teacher and you start to practice, even if your teacher is Shakyamuni and you're practicing at home by yourself, we're inhabiting a certain kind of a space. It's the same space. So at least one of Dogen's robes, I don't know how many robes Dogen had, but at least one of them still exists, right? We can still find it. It still exists. It's a 25-panel linen robe that apparently he cut and sewed by himself, so we can actually see his work. When he died, that robe went to his disciple Ejo, and we can go right down the line of transmission and know where it went. So from Ejo, it went to Gikai. From Gikai, it went to Keizan. Then it goes to Daichi Soke, who was a famous poet. In fact, Todo-san translated his text, Juniji Hogo, on practicing throughout the day, which is, I think, not a poem, but it's an interesting text. You can find it. He's translated that. So Daichi takes the robe with him to Kyushu. Goes back to where he was from. Takes this robe with him to Kyushu in southern Japan. It remains there in his temple for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So many temples, really old temples, have a storehouse or someplace where they keep the artifacts, the temple treasures, right? So this robe goes in there. We don't see it for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years until that temple decides, this robe would be safer in a museum. Because, of course, Japan is subject to crazy weather, typhoons and earthquakes and floods and stuff, If you saw what some of those temples looked like after the last earthquake in Japan, you would know why they wanted to move it out of there. Pieces of temple, lying on the ground, and they're just thinking this is a kind of a holy relic. This shouldn't be in a temple where it can be damaged. We should put it in a museum. So today, it's in the Kumamoto Prefectural Museum of Art. It is not on display. You can't just walk in there any old day and look at it. It's, in the stores. A few years ago, my Dharma brother Isan made an arrangement to go look at it. So he's actually gone and looked at it. And he said, and I wasn't supposed to touch it, but I touched it. So somewhere in our Dharma family, we have somebody who's actually touched Dogen's robe. Okay, so every 4 years, the museum gives this robe back to the temple that gave it to it for 3 days. So every 4 years, it's possible to go look at this robe and interact with this robe for 3 days. So they do ceremonies, they do various events, they unfold this robe, and it's possible for the monks there to actually try it on. Like, can you imagine? Now, I don't know about you. I've got to think the robe is probably this big. Most really old, okay, so if you look at them, I mean, they wouldn't fit me. They're very small. So I don't know. I've not seen this thing. But can you imagine? This robe comes back to your temple for 3 days every 4 years, and maybe you get to put that on. So talk about wearing Tathagata's teaching, right? Interesting. So can you imagine that? So yes, Shakyamuni and Dogen have crossed over. Their physical beings are not here, right? They're not in the physical world anymore. They've crossed over to Nirvana, but their relics, if you will, go on. So that includes, of course, awakening itself as Buddha. It includes the truth of the suchness of the Dharma. There's the Dharma. It includes practitioners wearing robes or not, and keeping this practice alive. So those three treasures go on, even though the physical body comes and goes. So unlike Dogen, we don't have Shakyamuni's actual robe today. I don't think we do. We have his Bodhi tree, descendant of his tree and some things. I don't think we've got his robe. Maybe it was burned with his body. Maybe it eventually fell apart. We don't know. Maybe it was apocryphal. But we have his Dharma body, right? And it is wrapped in every robe, here and there, right? We still have his Dharma body because we still have awakening. So that means Buddha is still here, right? Wearing an okesa or not, and carrying out practice. So somebody dies, somebody else picks up the robe, somebody else picks up the Dharma. This thing goes on. Practice goes on. So when we put on a robe for the first time in a day, we chant a verse. Some of us do this all the time. The third line is wearing the Tathagata's teachings, right? We free all being. Wearing Tathagata's teachings. So wearing the Buddha's teaching means that the robe and the Dharma are not separate. We're actually wearing the Dharma. So the thusness of the robe is the same thusness we find in everything we encounter, and that way it's not special. So we treat these robes as kind of special holy relics, but here's the Dharma, right? And here's the Dharma. So this, again, this nyoho, study of nyoho and nyoho-e can point us toward the truth of that teaching. So when the person wearing this robe dies, or the robe disintegrates because we've bleached it, the thusness is still there because why? It's a formless field of merit, as our chant says, right? This thing is a formless field of merit. So the robe is tangible. It has taishikiryo. It has materials. It has color. It has amount. And at the same time, it's formless. And this is why we see teachings like the robe will cover Maitreya and also cover Shakyamuni, and it's of an infinite size. And there's only, it doesn't matter. It fits everybody. So within the Nyoho tradition, those three elements, taishikiryo, are sort of modest and unassuming, and commercial robes, if you've ever seen them, are eye-wateringly colorful. I mean, they are neon. They look like fire trucks. They are almost painful in how bright they are. They're made from more luxurious fabrics or from really synthetic, plasticky fabrics sometimes. There can be metallic brocade, right? And as practitioners of nyoho, people who make nyoho-e, we sometimes look at those things and go, yikes, that's not okay. Well, if you're officiating at a funeral in Japan, you're expected to wear these very, very fancy robes. Often your danka would have bought them for you and therefore expect you to wear them, especially when it's their relatives that you're doing a memorial for, right? It's a thing about respect for the deceased and for the family, and so you wear your most exotic, right? Your most expensive, your most high-end stuff. So when we look at that, since we're learning about nyoho, practicing with nyoho, we might sort of turn up our noses and say, well, somehow that's less pure. Oh, that's commercial. Oh, it's brightly colored. Oh, it's got, metallic thread. Somehow that's not Buddha's robe. Somehow that's not okay. We have to be careful about that kind of judgment, right? We find the same thusness in all robes because all robes are fields of merit, formless fields of merit. So, when you encounter these things, part of your brain goes, that's not humble, that's not unassuming, that's synthetic fabric, it's not okay. And the rest of your brain, I hope, is saying, and that's Buddha's robe, right? And that's Dharma, because all robes are the same. So whether that robe was worn by Buddha, or it's a rakusu, being put on for the first time by the newest kaite in Sangha, whether that robe is simple cotton, sewn by hand, or it's some really high-end commercial garment worth thousands and thousands of dollars, they are all one with the Dharma. It's all the same. So when we finish sewing a robe, we might sigh with relief at the end of that project and go, there, it's done. It's finally done. Particularly if we're sewing for transmission, right? Where you're sewing a rakusu and a zagu and two okesas and all the cases that go with that. One of those okesas is lined. You have a zagu, right? There's a lot of sewing that goes with transmission. There's a lot that goes with ordaining as a novice, but there's twice as much that goes with transmission. So there, it's finally done, right? Done. Well, really? Is that the end of that story? Is that really the end of that story? Is there an end to that story? Is this moment really cut off from the moment when that robe falls apart? Or you fall apart wearing that robe, figuratively or not? Is this moment really cut off from the moment that the corpse was wrapped in the shroud before you took that fabric and made Buddha's robe? The moment, how about, is it really cut off from the moment you first stepped into a zendo? Is it really cut off from the moment your grandmother was born? Is it really cut off from the moment when your children wonder what you're going to do with that okesa? Right? Where does that robe begin and end? Where does life and death begin and end? Where does Shakyamuni begin and end? So one day a young monk got himself into trouble. He accidentally broke his master's favorite teacup. So the master lived and died by this teacup. It was this precious thing. Young monk is, I don't know, cleaning the room, something. He breaks this precious teacup. What is he going to do? So the master comes into the room, and the monk asks him, Master, why must people die? And the master says, well, you know, it's natural. Everything in this world, all the conditioned things in this world experience this life and death. And the monk says, Master, death has come upon your teacup. He was a smart guy, right? So death is going to come upon Shakyamuni. We know that. From the moment we read his birth story, we know somehow death is going to come upon Shakyamuni. It's going to come upon our robes. It's going to come upon ourselves, our favorite teacups. Is that the end? Is that the end of the story? So the robe is a particular gate we can go through in trying to deeply understand the Dharma. So are food and shelter, the other two faces of nyoho. So we have a whole year to consider these things as gateways. So things made according to the Dharma of thusness arise and perish because they are conditioned, right? We know that. They need causes to arise. The conditions have to be right for their arising, so they don't arise on their own, perish on their own. They're not disconnected from everything else. So awakening is not a conditioned object. So the absolute version of the three treasures are not conditioned. The absolute Buddha is the reality of awakening, and the absolute Dharma is the reality of the functioning of the universe, and the absolute Sangha is the reality of interconnectedness. Those things are not conditioned, right? Those things don't come and go. And at the same time, human bodies and robes and teacups arise and change and perish. And these two kinds of reality, these two sides of reality, are completely not separate. This is why we frequently hear from Todo-san, we have to see one reality from two sides and express two sides in one action. So the Dharma was here before the robe was made. The Dharma will be here after the person wearing the robe has gone to Nirvana and the robe has dissolved. But those two things are completely interpenetrated, and those two things are both completely 100% true. So we have people in the Sangha who are about to embark on sewing Rakusu or Okesa. Some for ordination as novices, some because you're kaite and you're taking precepts. So this is kind of front and center for you. It's front and center for all of us, but particularly perhaps for you. We've got the Jukai, or the lay precepts ceremony every year in July. People are going to be sewing for that. We ordain novices when they finish sewing robes, done all their other prep. So we take these steps. We make these public commitments to the practice, right? Put on a Rakusu. Wearing that Rakusu can result in taking on some kind of leadership in the Sangha. It doesn't have to, but it can. Certainly, I think wearing a novice okesa almost certainly means we're taking some kind of responsibility, some kind of leadership in the Sangha. So everyone knows over the last 8 years I've put a pretty high value on something I'm calling shared leadership. I don't think I've actually said much about what I think that means. So shared leadership doesn't mean we've all got our hands in everything that everybody else is doing. There are dozens of people around the country doing something related to leadership for Sanshin, right? Some kind of responsibility for Sanshin's practice or operations or governance or something, right? You can't possibly know everything, right, that's happening and have an opinion about everything that's happening. That's not what I mean by shared leadership. I don't mean we're all sharing the same leadership. We're not taking a vote of the entire Sangha every time something needs to happen. It would just be unwieldy and slow. Not what I mean. I mean that each person is exercising a particular kind of leadership, and someone is responsible for this, and someone's responsible for that, and someone's implementing this thing over here, right? All of that is held together by the long-range plan and the practice vision and all of those things. Everyone's rowing the same direction, but everyone has their own oar, if you will, right? Based on our karmic circumstances, our expertise, our interest, our time, what's going on with this body and mind, we're all stepping up and taking the leadership that's appropriate for us to take. And mine doesn't look like yours, and yours doesn't look like theirs, and you're right. So that's okay. What's holding that all together is this commitment to the Sangha and the practice vision and the long-range plan. So I trust each of those committees or directors or staff members or whoever to collaborate with whoever they need to collaborate with and do their jobs. I don't need to have my hands in everything. What a blessing that is, right? We're all making some kind of commitment. Maybe we're wearing this, maybe we're not. But there's leadership happening. And you've heard me say here before, simply chanting 4 bodhisattva vows and having an aspiration to be a bodhisattva is leadership. That is taking leadership. If nothing else, we are modeling practice for each other. We are enabling practice for each other, right? So there's shared leadership just at every level, which is related to the robe and also not. So when I step back in 2036, someone, I hope, is going to step up and sit in this seat and put on a robe and take up the robe, take up the dharma, carry forward Todo-san's original intention here, and I hope maybe a little bit of mine, and carry on. But that's only one person in one role, right? Wearing one robe. One person in one role. Others are going to continue to take on different, distinct kinds of leadership in their own areas of expertise. Maybe that includes wearing a robe. Maybe it doesn't. I don't think anybody's left out of that equation. So unfortunately, I've seen more than one Sangha go through some extremely tough times on the death of a teacher. There was effectively no shared leadership. People weren't sure how to wear the Tathagata's teachings, physically or not, as a means of making that dharma available to others. I could just see them looking around going, what do we do now? Shakyamuni students had the same question, I think, right? Here was the only teacher they'd ever really known. Everything was going through him. He was deciding what was good behavior and bad behavior and how things were going to function. He starts ordaining people. They go out in the world. They do have some shared leadership, but really, he's the only one they know. So you can imagine, here he is giving them his final teaching, and you've got to know they're thinking, what do we do now? Who picks up the robe? Right? How do we go on? So, of course, his response was, well, if you see the Dharma, you see me. Now, considering that, where Tathagata's teachings, it really kind of stops you in your tracks. What am I practicing? I'm getting up in the morning. I'm putting on Buddha's robe. Buddha says, if you see the Dharma, you see me. Wow. To me, that just, whoa, I got to think about that. There's something to ponder there. There's something really interesting there, right? So I think we each need to do some discernment about what we're doing, wearing Tathagata's teachings, wearing the Dharma. What are we doing? Embodying this thing, kind of, with the Dharma wrapped around us in this space. What are we doing? So whether we're wearing Tathagata's teaching in the form of a piece of actual fabric, or we're wearing the formless version, when you see the Dharma, you see Buddha. So if you see somebody wearing the Dharma, you see Buddha. Wow, I see somebody wearing a raksu, I see the Dharma, I see Buddha. Now what does it mean to take precepts and to sew a robe and to wear that? Whether you're wearing it in the Zendo or you're figuratively wearing it out in the world, what does that mean? When you see the Dharma, you see the Buddha. When you see somebody wearing a robe, you see the Dharma. Where are we going with that, right? So all of our actions of body, speech, and mind create karma. So what kind of karma are we creating when we put on the robe and do the practice? Or if we're simply wearing the robe and sort of going about our business in the temple, what kind of karma are we creating? What's the story that we're making available to people? So it feels like sometimes our practice is an individual thing, and whether or not I show up, it doesn't matter. If I decide to sit zazen, that's good for me. If I decide not to come to the temple and sit zazen today, well, nobody cares. And we can fall into that trap because of something called non-reliance that we talk about here, right? It's what gets you on the cushion is your own bodhicitta. Nobody's going to come and drag you in. And yet, we have some decisions to make. So if I choose not to come to the temple and put on this robe and sit zazen with other people, what does that mean for them? And then, by the same token, I come in today, it's a snowy day, it was hard for people to get here, and I look around and I see all these robes and rakusus, and I think, right, there's a lot of dharma going on here. There's something really encouraging about seeing somebody who's made the commitment, wearing the robe, here's the dharma, here's the Buddha. So if we think our practice doesn't matter to other people, well, I beg to differ. So what kind of legacy are we creating? What is going to keep unfolding after we die? And somebody else picks up the robe, somebody else picks up the dharma, or just somebody else picks up the threads of whatever we're putting out into the universe today. What's going on there? So if we're walking around wearing the dharma, I think these are some really big questions. Sometimes new novices go through the imposter syndrome, right? Well, yeah, someone put this robe on me. It might seem like I should know what I'm doing. I really don't have a clue, and I hope nobody figures that out. Like, what if they figure out that I don't have a clue what this means? So on this Nirvana day, when we consider the legacy of Shakyamuni and his robe, I think we can also consider our own legacy. So when I chant the verse and put on the robe, how am I occupying the robe? I'm wearing this dharma. How am I occupying this space? Wearing this dharma, what am I doing? The dharma is taking the shape of this body. So what is that about? And of course, the dharma is taking the shape of this body, whether we're wrapped in a physical robe or not. Everybody's body is this dharma body, right? So here it is. Like, what does that mean? What am I setting in motion here that's going to continue to unfold after I'm gone? So we can ask ourselves, when it's time for my funeral and the big photo of me is sitting up there on the altar, right, wearing my rakusu, what am I leaving behind? So let's see what others would like to say about death on the robe, anything related to that, or whatever is bubbling. I'm going to start with people here. We'll go with the people at home. Anything in the room anybody wants to bring up?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think one of the things that you kind of skirted around and mentioned, but you didn't mention directly, is that sewing forms you. It creates character. And it changes you. And I'll give you a really good example from my episodes of sewing. When I first started sewing my rakusu with Zuiko in Cedar Rapids, there was someone there, I believe Paige Applebaum, was sewing her okesa. And she related a story to us, there are 3 kaite sewing, of she had her first okesa first. We're like, what? It was in her backpack, and I think she was in Minneapolis or Milwaukee, I can't remember where, but it got stolen.
Mm-hmm.
And we're like, oh man.
It's like having your PhD thesis stolen out of your briefcase.
It was like, I would have changed religion. That was horrifying. That you'd have to go through all of this again. Unbelievable. And I was rather neophyte back then, and some years had passed, and I was here at Sanshin, and at first I was in an apartment, and I got my own condo, and so I moved everything, and got everything done, and I'm like, where's my okesa? Holy crap. Oh man, all right, I guess if I have to, I'll sew another one, but gee. And lo and behold, I found it. So, whoa, thank you.
Yes.
So as I started sewing my okesa, I had all of that in mind, But it never really was it was never really terrifying or horrifying. You know, the times there would be good natured, oh, you need to do it this way, you sew it, and I show it as we go, rip it out and restart all over again, do it over again and keep doing it again. And I did my Keisen, our rock suit, a week. It's like, wow, that was pretty quick. And when I think about that, and when I think about all of that, oh, and even more so, when you're diligently sewing as fast as you can, and someone shows up late and sews more than you sewed in an hour in 15 minutes, you're like, why does Buddha hate me? But you realize this is character. This is changing you. It is Buddha's robe. It is the dharma. And it being the dharma is right there, right in front of you, and it is the thusness that's confronting you. Mm-hmm. And as the Heart Sutra says, there is no fear. Mm-hmm. That's gone. Mm-hmm. It's just nothing more of, oh, okay, I have to sew again. All right, we'll do it. Mm-hmm. Nothing more.
And if you, and once you, so if you can't get to that place, sewing can be incredibly frustrating. I've seen, I'm sure many people have seen this too. Folks are ready to give up because they're so personally invested. Mm-hmm. So it's a really interesting conundrum because at the same time that we really want to do our very best practice, want to take care of this, right? You don't want to do this in a slapdash, oh well, I'm going to get it done kind of way, because it's not the attitude you want to take to your practice. And at the same time, when something goes wrong, you can't be personally attached to that, right? So one of the problems people sometimes have is they will keep ripping out and keep ripping out and keep ripping out because it's not perfect, and yet it would have been acceptable. Because they're so attached to, I'm going to wear this for the rest of my life and someone's going to see it, and this stitch isn't exactly perfect, right? That's almost as difficult as having to do it again and your teacher saying do it again, because there can be so much self-concept attached in it. So your overall point that the sewing is itself a really important practice of intimacy with thusness and dharma, mm-hmm. Absolutely, and if you have experience with sewing in a way that's a disadvantage, the first rock sew I ever made, had a needle in my hand for years already, and there's some disadvantage to that because you go in and think, this is a piece of cake. It's almost better if you don't have that, right? What would others like to say? Things here in the room? Please.
I'm wondering about what you said about sort of, this is making a robe is a way of setting the fabric free.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? I think that's such an interesting teaching.
Yeah, and I'm wondering sort of like, it is just one of those teachings that you just have to wrap yourself in or something.
Yeah, you have to let that one percolate.
Yeah, because I'm wondering what are kind of the boundaries of that? Like what that fabric is independent from you already sitting in the fabric store.
Yes, or wherever, on the corpse.
Or on the corpse. It's just being its own dharma self.
Yes.
And yet, when you enter into a relationship with it, in a way, you are taking away its freedom, and then you're giving it back if you're turning it into an kesa. Is that kind of a
sure? And look at what's taking away its freedom. It's your idea. I'm not slapping you. I'm saying a human being idea of what that's going to be, and how that's going to look, and how it's going to work, right? So we need to have agency in the world because we couldn't do our bodhisattva work without that. And so again, we have this case of, on the one hand, I need to manipulate this fabric to have an outcome, and on the other hand, I need to be completely free of expectation in order to liberate it, So it's always going to be what it is. We can't take that away from anything. Things are always going to be what they are. We can't rob anything of its thusness. We can not see it. We can not see the thusness, or we can choose to acknowledge the thusness or something. right? So where is that liberation actually happening? Is it happening for this item, or is it happening here, right? Because really, the only thing we can change is this, right? But when I came across that teaching, I thought that really turns things on its head. Because we think, I'm going to put this on and liberate beings. I'm going to be somebody now. I'm going to go out and liberate beings, man. That's my vow, you know? And we do that with all best intention. That's fabulous that somebody wants to make that kind of vow. And at the same time, how do we liberate this? How do we liberate this, right? How do we liberate things we don't like so much? Or things that are our precious? I just think that needs some pondering. And I really think that's one of those things that nyoho, thinking about nyoho and studying nyoho, is going to help us with, right? Because it isn't just the robe. I think it's really interesting, this thing about, taking fabric that has been on a corpse, which we go, ugh, and somehow it becomes this stainless dharma robe, and yet was it ever not that? Or is it just my idea that it wasn't that? At what point does it gain thusness? It doesn't. At what point was I really in control of that thing? It's all about this, right? Anyway, an interesting way to see reality. Folks at home, anything from you today? We all good?
Oh, there's Neil.
Oh, Neil, okay, thank you. Good. I need Sawyer to help me see people.
Yeah, thank you for your talk today. And I appreciated the reminder of the story of the teacup, because I had a precious, had a precious coffee cup that I was very fond of. And one that was kind of like something gotten from an artist. So, more expensive than I would usually spend. So I enjoyed it a lot. But, in enjoying it, I knew that just knowing how I treated dishes, there's no way it would survive forever. But yeah, especially the story about tension, like the cup broke this week, and I'm seeing it broken. It was my actions that did it, and there was that immediate sense of loss. Can I glue it back together safely? Things like that. And so yeah, just working with that feeling of I knew it wouldn't last forever, but now I've gotten to the point where it's broken. And so that resonated. And then I think also the stories about thinking about the earthquakes affecting temples in Japan, and thinking about temples also losing their leadership, and just thinking about these kind of larger transitions, that when there are disasters or changes in our communities or larger ones, there could be a perception that things are breaking or dying. And I just, I think there's the challenge in those moments to say, how do we take action effectively or skillfully, and kind of just, I don't know, and still being centered and grounded in those moments. So yeah, I think I've experienced it at a small level and a large level. And so thank you very much.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. When it comes to Nirvana Day, we can study the story of Shakyamuni and the story of his passing over, and that's important. And then also, I think it's an opportunity for us to step back and say, where is impermanence happening? And how do I practice with impermanence, right? So I think we have a real tendency when something breaks, dissolves, tears, to fix it. I want to fix it. And I want to fix it so it's exactly like it used to be. Tenjin talks about this with his robe. He says for 50 years, people have been trying to help him patch and fix and put back together this robe. He says that in itself has been an interesting practice, right? And when I took all those falling apart robes from that Sotoshu conference, and they were threadbare. I tried, you pick them up and they literally dissolve in your hand. So I'm thinking I'm going to have to put mesh over it to hold it together. As soon as I do that, now I have an extra layer. According to Vinaya, there's only so many layers you can have. it becomes a thing, right? So I had to put it aside because I have to think about what I'm doing. But we have this tendency with it, the cup or the robe or a relationship or a temple. We want to fix it like it never happened. Well, the reality is probably something has permanently shifted. So can we do the repair, do the resolution, whatever that is, in some way which is not stuck in a moment which has come and gone, right? So we can maybe patch that cup. You can maybe glue it back together. It's going to have a crack in it, right? We can patch the robe. It's going to have a patch. We can put the temple back together, but chances are, oh, there's a new beam there. It's not going to look like the 800-year-old beam, right? So the practice of fixing and patching is a whole interesting thing too. You may be familiar with something called kintsugi. Kintsugi, eh? Fixing a broken piece of ceramic with gold, so it's not, you don't put it back like it was, you put it back where there's gold in those seams. You can see that that was broken and put back together. And now it has a whole different kind of beauty. Yeah? So that is a whole interesting set of teachings, what you're bringing up, right? Which is, again, worth pondering. I think that's important. So every year when Nirvana Day comes around, these are the things I think that kind of rise up for us, right? Buddha's, Shakyamuni is gone. Now what? I broke the teacup, like, now what? The temple fell apart. Now what? It won't ever be the same. That doesn't mean it can't be effective and wholesome, but we have to let go, right? Which is not easy. What would other folks like to say, if anything?
Hey, Hoko.
Yes.
This is Max. Again,
Hi, Sachin.
yeah, thank you for your teaching. Again, I think one of the things that resonated with what you said to me was when he dyed the fabric. And for me, nyoho has been very symbolic of coming back in groundedness in the practice. But even with that dissolution, they don't last forever. So even with the robes and they don't last forever, it goes back to what you were saying about impermanence. But where is our practice really grounded in? What is that? Like you said, we hold ourselves accountable for the practice. But for me, I know that Rakusu has been very helpful for me lately, especially in grounding me in my practice. And even in that, what you're saying, that too will dissolve. So what is there left for us is our own kind of commitment to our practice. So that's kind of what stood out for me today.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're back to bodhicitta, right? What do we rely on? We rely on our own bodhicitta. And yet we put that robe on, we put that rakusu on, and it's encouraging for us, and it's encouraging for those who see us, right? Even if you're practicing at home, probably you put on that rakusu before you sit down. There's something about that. Your body goes, oh, okay, I know what I'm going to do now, right? I know what I'm about to do. It helps us break preoccupation and sort of renew our commitment and say, oh, now I'm in a kind of a space where I'm going to focus. But if we don't have the rakusu, we need to still be able to practice, right? So it's like if we don't, if we're practicing at home or we're on the road or something and we don't have a temple, well, we ought to be able to sit zazen in the bus station. Is that easy? No, right? But it doesn't matter where we are. So there's something, awakening is still there, right? The absolute version of Buddha treasure is still there. We have things to help us and support us and handrails and all of those things are good and they're also conditioned. And so we can't rely on them. Just like we can't rely on Shakyamuni's physical body. So everything coming and going, right? What else would folks like to say, here or at home?
Just a brief
Please.
follow-up to that. Which
Yeah.
it reminds me of something that Colin said in the workshop, which was helpful to me. It was like how he kind of encapsulated nyoho was, he compared it to the Bodhi tree. As in, this is the structure under which Buddha sat. These were like the conditions that nourished his awakening.
Right.
So giving attention to things like how you make a robe or how you cook a meal or all of these things that are basically, it's like you're creating the conditions around which are favorable to awakening. But
Absolutely.
they're not necessary in a certain way.
Yeah, well, sure, for enabling practice. So, folks laugh at me sometimes because I talk a lot about the practice container. And that's not original. Actually, somebody I knew years ago used to call it the practice container. Oh, okay, I get that. There's something about that which encloses us and encourages practice. So that's, it can be the zendo, but it can be the conditions. So if one of the things that is a support condition for me is putting this on, or sitting in a certain place, or lighting a candle, or whatever that is, those conditions can be really important. And we know we can't cling to them. They're not going to do our practice for us. They're not going to guarantee anything for us. But if they support us in our practice, we need conditions, right? So we have bodhicitta, great, now what? Let's create some favorable conditions, which includes practicing together. Anything else this morning before we move into Nirvana Day service? We good for now? Okay, so we are going to do our closing chant. We're going to do the Nirvana Day service. For folks at home,
I posted it.
thank you. Sawyer has posted what we're going to chant today, Heart Sutra and Shakyamuni. Before we do the service, I'll review quickly what we're about to do so people know that. And then for folks here, of course, we have potluck. So I've seen some nice food in the kitchen. So we'll have a nice day. All right, anything else this morning? Let's do our closing chant.